Can't see. Hello. Welcome to the National Advisory Committee's final webinar. My name is Kayla Johnston. I'm the Director of Education at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I oversee education matters, development of learning resources, outreach initiatives, as well as public engagement on the history and legacy of residential schools. In addition to that, I get to work with our statement gathering team in communities. For those who are wishing to share those experiences about their residential school experience, as well as other colonial systems. I wanted to welcome everyone to this webinar as we complete our activities for the National Advisory Committee on Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. Today's webinar is called Dispelling the Myths of Denialism, specifically residential school denialism. This is where we're going to learn about the role of denialism in colonial contexts. We're going to explore confronting residential school denialism as central to truth before reconciliation. We're going to get and gain some insights on how media and academia help shape public narratives, help challenge the framing of denialism, and how we can center those truths in both education and reconciliation. Now, before we get any further, I wanted to just highlight, if you're looking to get access to the previous webinars from working with French records, forensic examination, repatriation from a community perspective, you can gain access to those videos as well as today's session on the NCTR YouTube page. Now, before we get started, I have a few housekeeping details, first being a land acknowledgement. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Inanawak, the Inishnenanawak, the Dakota Oyute, and the Dene Sulin peoples. In addition to that, we are also located on the homeland of the Red River Métis, and we're also the home of many Inuit. I also wanted to highlight trauma supports. If today's conversations are a little bit triggering, or if you feel you need that additional support, there is the Hope for Wellness helpline. You can contact them at 1-855-242-3310. That's 1-855-242-3310. And there's also the National Indian Residential Schools Crisis Line. That number is 1-866-925-4419. That's 1-866-925-4419. Now, my last housekeeping detail before I hand it to our elder for our opening prayer is related to interpretation. For our guest panelists today, just like to give a little reminder that we are providing French interpretation, so must speak at a little bit of a reduced pace. And for those looking for that interpretation, what you'll have to do in the room here is click the little interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, select your preferred language channel, and then mute the original audio if you're only wanting to hear the interpretation. This session will be recorded, as I mentioned, and made available on the NCTR YouTube channel. With that, I would like to extend the virtual mic to Elder Harley Crowshoe for our opening prayer. Before I do so, I'll read just a very short bio for Harley, who is a Blackfoot elder and honorary chief of the Piikani Nation. He has served in various leadership roles, including the Director of Southern Alberta Indigenous Health Program, as well as the Alberta Northwest Territories Regional Manager for the Aboriginal Policing Directorate. And as a former RCMP officer, Harley brings decades of experience in Indigenous health, wellness, and justice. He currently advises a number of programs and continues to serve his community through cultural and ceremonial leadership. With that, I will pass the virtual mic to Elder Crowshoe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla. It's such an honor to be here. And you know, I really believe that these webinars really, give us a better understanding as to the process that we were on in finding those missing children from the residential schools, but also the topics that sometimes can be very difficult are important to have that conversation like today, dispelling the myths of denialism. My prayer today is asking the Creator to be with us during the session, to all of us, whether it's the circle of survivors, the elders in our communities, our families in the communities that have experienced and still experiencing that loss, and also to the communities as a larger group. But our prayers will be for everybody, even the ones that don't believe or have trouble understanding the truth or seeing the truth. And we pray for them too, so that their minds and their hearts open up to understand the impact of what the residential school you know did for all of us as Indigenous people. My name is Gayupika, which is Bear Child. I come from the Gundy Nation, which is in southern Alberta as part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And I'm just so honored to be able to be here to say the opening prayer. And I'll use this sacred eagle feather because we believe that eagle spirit carries our prayers to the Creator in such a loving way and protects those prayers as it carries them to the Creator. The same as they protect their children so fiercely and with so much love. So with that, I'll start my prayer. Creator, Grandfather, Nina, you're known by many loving names. I, Gayubika, come before you in a humble way, with tears in my eyes and ancient song in my heart. I pray to the powers of creation, to Grandfather Sun, to Grandmother Moon, to Mother Earth, and to the holy ancestors, like the holy grandfathers and grandmothers. And I pray for my relatives in nature, the ones that fly, swim, crawl, and walk, the ones that are seen and unseen, and to all the good spirits that exist in all parts of creation. Creator, today is such a beautiful day, and we gather here from many locations across Mother Earth. And we just give thanks for this opportunity, be able to hear and be able to really understand some of the challenges that are out there, but really to get to know the impact and the truth of that impact from the residential school. Creator, we give thanks for our lives, and because the gift of life is such a beautiful gift, and we give thanks for that. As we live our lives, we're able to experience all the many wonders and miracles that you've given us, Creator, and we give thanks for that. We give thanks for that beauty around us and all that new life that comes on Mother Earth during the springtime. And we give thanks for that, Creator. Creator, we give thanks for our families. I ask you to be with us, today, and be with the people that are sharing their knowledge, and ask you to watch over us and pray that this is a safe place where we're able to hear, to learn, and to be able to have some input as we move forward on this journey. Creator, we give thanks for many gifts you've given us. The gift of ceremony, the sacred songs, and coming to you in prayer, Creator. Because I know, Creator, you watch over us and you protect us because we're your children, Creator. We're the children of the earth. And we give thanks for that. Ask you to watch over all the speakers as they share with us and they present their knowledge and their experience so we can understand in a better way. I ask you to be with Kyla as she moderates this session, and we just give thanks for the National Center Terms and Truth and Reconciliation for being that leader and taking the time to bring these types of opportunities forward so that we can learn. I pray for the survivors, the elders that have experienced the impact of residential school, but are still experiencing, you know, the finding ways of bringing our children home, the ones that went missing, never came back. And Creator, we just give thanks for them and their resilience and their teachings and the sacred knowledge that they share with us, Creator, because our elders are so special, Creator. Creator, we pray for everybody that are going to be part of this conversation, but even for the ones that don't quite understand the truth yet, or don't know the truth, or don't want to know that truth, we pray for them too, Creator, so that maybe at one point that their minds open, their hearts open, and there's understanding. And Creator, be with us, help us on this journey, and I pray that the conversations today are help us and are positive, and it helps understand the importance of the journey and gives us that strength to continue on moving forward, because healing is so important, Creator, to heal from what happened in the past. So I ask you to be with us, Creator. I ask for beauty above us. I ask for beauty below us. I ask for beauty around us. I ask for beauty in each and every one of us, Creator. All my relations. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, hi. Thank you so much, Elder Croshu, for your opening prayer, this grounding presence that you bring to the webinar, the prayers for the webinar survivors, those joining us today, and those who will view the video in the future, for Creator being here with us, as well as that healing component. I'm now going to turn to our two panelists today who will be talking about residential school denialism. Before I pass it off to our first panelist, I've been with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation 10 going on 11 years, and then previous to that was with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And with that, one of the main messages that I've been hearing from survivors is in relation to those experiences they had, and as shared, that component of truth before reconciliation. And so I find it very interesting to see an increase in residential school denialism, which seems to, I would expect the opposite, given the amount of information that is now out there and easily accessible. So I'm very eager and interested to learn from both of our panelists. So I now would like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Sean Carlton is a settler historian and associate professor in the departments of history and Indigenous studies at the University of Manitoba. He is author of Lessons in Legitimacy, Colonialism, Capitalism, and the Rise of State Schooling in British Columbia from UBC Press in 2022. And for his presentation, Sean will be talking about the historicized and theorized the role of denialism in colonial contexts, framing statements like Senator Lynn Bayak's 2017 speech as discursive strategies to uphold colonial power. His presentation will explore how confronting residential school denialism is central to that mandate of truth before reconciliation. Now, each speaker will have roughly about 30 minutes each, but I won't be cutting anyone off. So I would like to pass the virtual mic to Sean to start his presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Kayla and Elder Croshu for getting us started in that good way. It's great to be in conversation again with the NCTR, and most importantly, thanks to all of you for attending today's talk. I'm really grateful that you've all made time in your busy days and your busy lives to come and connect and learn more about residential school denialism, the hurtful and negative effects it can have for Indigenous people and residential school survivors specifically, as well as to talk about how you can identify and confront it, to, as Kayla is pointing out, help put truth before reconciliation and live up to the promises of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So I'm just going to share some slides and then get into my presentation. Okay, so what we want to do today is talk more about some of our research that is trying to grapple with and confront the growing phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada. And Niigaan and I have been collaborating for a number of years, and we're trying to put some of our writing and ideas together for a new project with a number of exciting contributors. And today, I'm going to talk a little bit from the introduction that we're working on and share some of our ideas about why dispelling with the myth of denialism is so important to truth and reconciliation work, especially as we mark the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's summary report this month. And hey, it's also National Indigenous History Month, so this is a good time for this challenging but important conversation. I'm going to begin, as Kayla noted, by historicizing, contextualizing, and theorizing residential school denialism, or explaining what it is and why some people promote it, this kind of mis and disinformation about residential schooling as part of an attack on truth and reconciliation. And Niigaan is going to offer some additional thoughts about why denialism is so dangerous. And then we can have a conversation about what we can do about this. So that's our at least my outline to get us started. I've also put the Indian Residential School Survivors and Family Crisis line there, and that information is made available in the chat as well. Okay, and I'm going to begin by rooting this discussion in an explanation of the controversy over Lynn Beek, who is pictured here. And in March 2017, Lynn Beek, a conservative senator and a member of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, delivered a speech defending Canada's Indian residential school system as being, quote, well-intentioned. Beek briefly admitted that mistakes were made, but she spent the majority of her speech insisting that an emphasis on the system's positives will help, quote, Canada's Native people to thrive as victors, not victims. Beek's speech, made only a year after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission showed Canadians the evidence of how residential schooling constituted genocide, sparked an intense public controversy for those that remember. The senator's attempts to put a positive spin on what even Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister who appointed Beek to the Senate, called a sad chapter in Canada's history during his apology to survivors in the House of Commons. Beek's attempts here was not appreciated by many, including her fellow senator and the former chair of the TRC, Murray Sinclair, who, when initially asked about Beek's comments and other residential school deniers, he quipped that they were dim-witted. Even the Anglican Church, which ran a third of the schools across the country, including the Pelican Lake Residential School near Dryden, Ontario, where Beek lives, weighed into the debate to clarify that, in fact, nothing good came from the schools. Oops, sorry. The church, like the TRC, noted that while a small minority of survivors speak of positive school experiences on a personal level, those experiences must be understood as occurring in the wider context of a genocidal school system designed to kill the Indian and the child. So understanding a systemic understanding of the system rather than focusing on individual experience. Now, despite facing widespread criticism for her comments, Beek refused to apologize. Instead, the senator stood behind her positive perspective, even attacking criticism of her speech as fake news and exaggeration. This was in the early days of Trump's first presidency, and she's borrowing some of the rhetorical tactics that Trump was using at the time. Beek doubled down on her defense of residential schooling, arguing, quote, there are shining examples from sea to sea of people who owe their lives to these schools. Right there, you can see the focus on the individual to excuse the system. When pressed on how Indigenous people, especially the many former students who were physically and sexually abused in the schools, including one of my own family members, how they might feel about these statements, Beek elaborated, quote, I've suffered with them. I appreciate their suffering more than they'll ever know, but the best way to heal is to move forward together, not to blame, not to point fingers, not to live in the past. Now this line. You've really stepped in it when the Beaverton, which is a satirical news site, kind of like The Onion in the United States, has a good laugh at your expense, right? With the title, Senator Bayek demands residential school survivors apologize for her suffering. When she was eventually confronted by reporters after making her speech and asked directly if she had even bothered to read the Truth and Reconciliation report to better understand the history and ongoing legacies of the schools that she was downplaying, Bayek simply stated, and this is the important part, quote, "I don't need any more education." Now, as a result of her comments, Bayek was removed from the Senate Committee on Indigenous Issues in 2017, and she was actually later kicked out of the Conservative caucus. But she retained her Senate seat for another 4 years, and she used her platform and position to popularize residential school denialism. And in particular, she used her website, her publicly funded website, to do so, posting a number of letters of support and further comments defending herself. So she used her platform to popularize residential school denialism, which, to be very clear from the beginning, is not the denial that the system existed, but rather, by definition, denialism is the rejection or the attempt to twist, misrepresent, or discredit basic facts rooted in well-documented evidence in favor of more controversial positions. In this way, residential school denialism is similar to other kinds of denialism, like climate change denialism, science and vaccine denialism, AIDS denialism, etc. Right? They're all borrowing from a similar toolkit. Denialism in general is a deliberate strategy used to try and shake public confidence in something. And in this case, it is about truth and reconciliation, and I'll explain why in a moment. Now, while not wanting former students of residential schools to dwell on their victimization at the hands of state and church officials, in the aftermath of her 2017 comments, Bayek quickly constructed herself as a victim of politically motivated attacks on free speech, which is a common tactic that denialists often use. Rather than reflection, Bayek dug in and fortified her position by using her Senate website here to post the full text of her speech and personal statements, as well as a selection of letters that she received supporting her comments. Now, it is tempting to stereotype those who engage in residential school denialism as just being ignorant bigots, or to simply ignore them so as to deny them the recognition they seek for themselves and their ideas. But before he passed, Murray Sinclair suggested a different approach that Niigaan and I try and build on and amplify in our work, and we want to emphasize today and invite others to consider. Right? At first, he said, they were dim-witted, and then he corrected himself and said, we actually have a responsibility. If we want to put truth before reconciliation, we need to shift our tactic, and we need to figure out a way to show that they are wrong. And so, in that spirit, Sinclair argues that it's actually not enough for us to simply yell at deniers and knock them down. Instead, we need to try to understand their reasoning and show people why they're wrong. He elaborates saying, quote, "I've always been convinced that we may not deal with all of the denialists, we can at least take away their tools." And by challenging the comments of high-profile people like Bayek and others, Sinclair was hopeful that denialists will have a diminishing population of people who will believe them. Sinclair, in short, advocates a strategy of engagement to contain, disprove, and discredit denialists and to support survivors. So taking away the tools, though, of residential school denialists requires a better understanding of those tools and how and why people employ and defend them. So in order to do that, I'm a historian, so I've got to start with some history. And one of the first things that I like to talk to people about is that while residential school denialism is absolutely on the rise in very concerning ways, it's actually important to begin by emphasizing that residential school denialism is not a new phenomenon. Indeed, downplaying or minimizing the destructive effects of residential schooling for Indigenous children has a long history in Canada, going back to the origins of the system. Indeed, for much of the system's history, state and church officials likened the schools to humanitarian, even sacred or divine in the Christian sense enterprise, designed to save indigenous communities from extinction in the face of a so-called higher form of civilization. That was the racist rhetoric that was often used to defend them, right? Even when faced with irrefutable evidence of poor instruction, horrific conditions, deaths in schools, right? Officials mostly clung to that humanitarian discourse and discredited the system's detractors, including some Indigenous parents and students, of course, right from the beginning, but also non-Indigenous experts as well. In the early 1900s, as the system was still getting started, right? The system doesn't peak until 1950. So in the early 1900s, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, for example, who was the Department of Indian Affairs' chief medical officer, published a report for the Department of Indian Affairs, which actually received a lot of news coverage at the time, as evidenced by the headline in the bottom left-hand corner here, right? Actually slamming residential schools for much of what we now know about the system, right? Its abnormally high rate of student death and disease that he argued was exacerbated by things like overcrowding, poor nutrition, and a lack of proper sanitation in many of the schools, which was linked to its underfunding, right? This poor partnership between church and state. They kind of the subcontracting of the running of the system out to churches by the federal government. And so he makes this report in 1907. It gets covered. This article here, Indian schools deal out death. Startling rate of mortality is shown in report to the department, 25%. Okay. Much of what many Canadians were shocked by to learn that there were deaths in residential schools in 2021 and subsequently. This was on the front page of the Times Colonist out in Victoria in British Columbia in 1907. Right, so people knew about what Bryce was trying to alert people to very early on. But instead of rectifying the system's obvious problems, the department chose to bury Bryce's report. As a medical expert, Bryce tried to blow the whistle on the system in its initial phase. He's so frustrated by being silenced that he goes and publishes a book, including all of the correspondence showing the sort of structure of indifference as displayed by the Department of Indian Affairs. And this is from 1922, The Story of a National Crime. But still, despite all of this work, church and state officials chose to selectively focus on the positive results that the system was having, or more correctly, that they hoped it would have. And residential schooling, right, doesn't become compulsory until 1920. So after Bryce's initial report, and it actually grows to the peak of the system in terms of enrollment in the 1950s. So the system was allowed to continue until the mid to late 1990s because that humanitarian narrative, the focus on the positive, was so strong. It was not actually until former students began publishing accounts of their abuse in the schools, people like Basil Johnson and others, and began organizing for redress in the 1980s, that this humanitarian discourse or narrative about residential schooling started to shift significantly in the mainstream, right? The power started to change. As more students spoke about their school experiences, they emboldened others to come forward, eventually sparking a movement led by former students to collectively seek compensation for their time spent in the institutions. While many state and church officials were still denying any wrongdoing in the 1980s and 1990s, students forced the issue by launching at the time the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, which the government of Canada chose to settle out of court by agreeing to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006-2007, which put in motion, right, this process of truth and reconciliation, the apology by the government in 2008, as well as the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the same month of June 2008, right, to research and raise national awareness about residential schooling. All of this is part of the remedy of this lawsuit, not because the government of Canada had a change of heart, right, but because they were forced into this issue by the class action lawsuit, which they knew that they would likely lose and have to pay out a significant amount more, and so they chose to settle out of court. This is Canada. In short, Canada was forced on to the path of truth and reconciliation. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which started its work in 2008, published its final report in 2015. And the conclusions shocked many Canadians, but confirmed what generations of Indigenous peoples and historians already well understood. The Commission, however, made clear that shaming and pointing out wrongdoing, no matter how people read it or experienced it, right, that wasn't the TRC's mandate. Instead, the focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation. They argue that we must have truth before reconciliation. Their formula is very easy. Truth will lead to healing and justice. Healing and justice will give us a shot at reconciliation, a better future. Now, many Canadians have embraced the challenge put forward by the TRC and are, in differing ways, engaged in reckoning with Canada's colonial past to create a better future. And I have to believe that the vast majority of you are here because you're part of this process. Others, however, like Bayek, are choosing to dispute, deny, and discredit the Commission's findings as an excuse to avoid participating in the work of reconciliation. You don't have to deal with a history that you deny. And to be sure, grappling with matters of genocide is not easy. But it is the task that Indigenous and in particular, non-Indigenous people, such as myself, living in what is currently Canada, are being asked to do in the era of truth and reconciliation. So let's pause for a moment and think about, how we can get our heads around this to get into a good position, being open, as Elder Crowshoot mentioned, to the truth. And here, the scholarly literature in the field of genocide studies can actually help shed light on how different countries around the world are dealing with the legacies of different kinds of genocide and addressing the phenomenon of denialism in particular. In fact, denial is often considered the final stage of a genocide. So denialism shouldn't be something that we're surprised by. It should be a predictable part of the process here. In fact, political scientist Adam Jones argues that the manipulation of memory and history often occurs in the aftermath of genocides. In looking at Germany's grappling with the Jewish Holocaust as an example, he shows how a willful amnesia and a politicized forgetting emerged in the immediate post-war period as a way to distance the country and its citizens of its very recent Nazi past and its ongoing effects. And reflecting on the psychology of denialism, Jones argues that individual and collective narcissism play a pivotal role in buttressing denial. And in many contexts, a denialist stance heads off the cognitive dissonance between one's preferred view of self and country and the grimmer reality. And he also notes that there's absolutely an element of material self-interest included, people wanting to keep power and privilege. Insights from genocide studies around the world overlap with lessons from recent Indigenous studies literature. And Niigaan and I are in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. And a lot of Indigenous studies scholars have looked at the role of denial and denialism in Canadian colonialism. In fact, our former colleagues at the University of Manitoba, Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt, in their recent work have illustrated how Canadians like to imagine that they've always acted with peaceful and good intentions, right? Canadians do not like to hear that their country was founded through frauds and abuses and even violence perpetrated against Indigenous people. Instead of confronting this reality, Canadians seek refuge in myths of benevolence and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that they often learn in high school and is promoted in popular culture that justify colonial policy as being well-intentioned, even necessary and enlightened, or humanitarian. To be Canadian, according to Stolo writer Lee Maracle, is to be sunk in deep denial. Instead of seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to change their relations to these lands and to the original peoples, Miracle argues that Canadians, quote, tend towards defensiveness. Now, it's also helpful to theorize the role of denialism in colonial societies. Again, just to show you that the denialism is actually a predictable part of this process. And here we turn to the work of anti-colonial writers from outside of Canada. In particular, Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized. If you're looking for an interesting summer read, I recommend this book. And this consists of a psychological profile of both based on the author's experiences in North Africa. And it's especially insightful because it looks at the role of denialism in legitimizing colonialism as commonsensical, making it seem normal. And while some Indigenous scholars, such as our colleague Emma Larocque, have examined Memmi's portrait of the colonized in relation to Indigenous struggles in Canada, we think it's helpful to focus on Memmi's portrait of the colonizer and its applicability to Canadian settlers. And this aspect of Memmi's work has received less attention, but I think it is very insightful. So here, Memmi argues that colonizers are confronted daily with the reality of the illegitimacy of their status. Their very existence is a crisis of legitimacy. Whether colonizers are immigrants or are born in the colonies, they are always, even if only subconsciously, plagued by the question, what entitles me to live here? Fears about retribution, even revenge by the colonized, only stoke a kind of ever-present colonial anxiety, as we think Starblanket and Hunt's new book on the Gerald Stanley trial make clear are applicable here in Canada too. In an attempt to resolve these unsettled feelings, colonizers invent and deploy a whole host of strategies to protect their position of privilege in the colonies and to prove to themselves and to others the legitimacy of their existence, right? Their right to live and prosper. In addition to creating specific laws and the creation of things like prisons and schools to contain and control the colonized physically, Memmi contends that colonizers also invent and invest themselves in a series of myths and stereotypes propagated through various channels, including art and education and the writing of history, to rationalize the oppressive colonial relationship that underpins the material prosperity of colonizers as natural, inevitable, and most importantly, unchangeable. Although Memmi argues that all colonizers benefit from colonialism, he actually differentiates the behavior of two main groups, the colonizer who refuses and the colonizer who accepts. In short, the colonizer who refuses comes to the realization that colonialism is, in fact, unjust and vows to challenge the oppression of the colonized and fight for their freedom. This is no easy task, though, because the liberation of the colonized requires colonizers to question and challenge the legitimacy of their own existence and think of a completely different way of living, of relating to one another in society. As a result, Memmi argues that most colonizers simply resign themselves to accept colonialism and its benefits, becoming a colonizer who accepts. So we argue that properly historicized, contextualized, and theorized, denialism can thus be understood as a powerful tool for protecting the status quo in colonial settings, including here in Canada. Rather than unsettle the history of Canada and confront the ongoing legacy of colonization as called for by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and others, right? As Memmi's The Colonizer Who Refuses might do, some Canadians, like Bayek and others, are employing the tools of Memmi's The Colonizer Who Accepts. That is, they deploy a denialist discourse that justifies their existence, their home on native land, through a combination of degrading Indigenous peoples and clinging to selective and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that they think absolves them of any wrongdoing and justifies their lack of support for reconciliation. And targeting residential schooling and trying to put a positive spin on it is one way in which they are doing so. Now, I want to clear some room for Niigaan. So I've sort of given you the what is denialism, how can we understand it, why do people do it, why do people say, residential schooling was well-intentioned, it was of the past. abuse is exaggerated, deaths didn't happen, or they were unavoidable. We should focus on all the positive intentions, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are very common denialist talking points that they use over and over and over again, hoping that it will just become normal, right? Um, and just before I pass things to Niigaan, I want to show that, Beek is gone, right? She retired from the Senate in 2021, but the denialism that she helped popularize remains a barrier to reconciliation, and it is very much on the rise. And Murray Sinclair did point this out to us before he passed. And our argument is that Beck's comments defending residential schooling and trying to undermine public confidence in the TRC is actually just one example of this growing concerning phenomenon of residential school denialism. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, and I know Niigaan's going to talk more about this. But just to give you a sampling, there was a teacher in Abbotsford, BC, who assigned a homework assignment where students were instructed to search for online articles outlining only the positive experiences of residential schools. We often focus, on the far right, and it has certainly become part of that movement. But we do see a number of folks engaging in denialism, like former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, right, who spread denialism on a talk radio show by essentially saying, well, I went to a private boarding school and I had a great experience, so I don't really understand what the problem is, which is completely outrageous because Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs in the 60s. He, would have known and been lobbied by different groups about, the problems with the residential school system. But in later in life, he's come to sort of romanticize or completely erase his involvement in that system and should be criticized for that. But we also have here Aaron O'Toole, former Conservative leader, who was caught on camera, right, coaching young Conservatives on how to manipulate residential school history to score political points, the kind of cherry picking strategies. Don't talk about Johnny MacDonald and his involvement in the origins of the system. Shift the focus to liberal involvement. When in reality, we need to confront, the truth that the residential school system was a bipartisan project where the Conservatives and Liberals both invested time and energy into that system. To a number of academics, many of them fired, tired, or retired, who've engaged in or supported denialism, denigrating Indigenous communities, searching the former sites of residential schools for potential unmarked graves, looking for small errors to try and shift the conversation, distract people, calling it all just fake news and a hoax. It's pretty disgusting. Mostly just the same handful of sad people, the usual suspects that are part of the anti-Indigenous industry in this country. But the problem is that increasingly politicians, especially on the far right, have started to legitimize denialist discourse as a way of garnering support amongst far right conspiratorial types in our moment. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith spread the mass grave hoax narrative on her for-profit social media platform. Current Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in Winnipeg recently giving a fundraising talk for the Frontier Centre, right, a far-right think tank that has done much to spread residential school denialism, including in 2008 taking out radio ads questioning the truths about the system. In the most recent federal election, he stood behind a residential school denialist candidate out in British Columbia. Many people say, this is just harmful things that people are saying often on the internet. And this is maybe a good segue into some of what Niigaan's going to say. But, we need to recognize that words shape action. And Niigaan and I live in Winnipeg, where recently we've had a serial killer who was targeting Indigenous women, who at the time of his crimes was posting residential school denialism. And we need to take stock of this very seriously, right? And not diminish the harms that it has, right? It's supposed to undermine truth and reconciliation, but it has very devastating real effects. So all of these examples, and we can talk more of this about this in the questions, they seek to misrepresent residential school history in ways that downplays the system's devastating effects. And we must take these attacks on truth and reconciliation seriously. Denialists, then, are not simply just dim-witted. They are afraid that reconciliation will unsettle their material interests and position of power in colonial society, whether personally or politically. In keeping with Memi's profile of the colonizer who accepts, Bayek and other residential school denialists are choosing to seek refuge in an assemblage of myths and misinformation and untruths. Our argument is that this is a false refuge. Right? Denying the colonial past and present actually prevents settlers from being part of the project of reconciliation and the efforts to build sustainable and reciprocal relations with Indigenous people that could actually resolve that crisis of legitimacy and help them live in these lands in good or at least better ways. Thus, contrary to Bayek's response when pressed by a reporter about her defense of residential schools, right, that she didn't need any more education, it's clear that actually what is needed in our current era of truth and reconciliation is more and not less education about the ongoing effects of Canadian colonization and the opportunities for all in deep, unsettling, and meaningful reconciliation. And I'm really happy to be part of this webinar that helps create space for that uncomfortable learning. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kayla.
Hi, thank you so much, Sean, for that very engaging presentation. Whenever I do these events, I take a lot of notes and I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good question. I'm like, oh, you answered the question in that presentation. So I'm hoping to pull some of this, what you shared in our kind of panel discussion piece after Niigaan Sinclair presents. So I wanted to give just like I did for Sean, quick bio topic overview, and then I'll hand that virtual mic to Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, who is an Anishinaabe from Peguis First Nation and a professor at the University of Manitoba, where he holds the Faculty of Arts Professorship in Indigenous Knowledge and Aesthetics. He is an award-winning columnist and a writer and was named the 2019 Peace Educator of the Year by the Peace and Justice Studies Association at Georgetown University. For his presentation, Niigaan will be providing some insights on that public narrative, how it's shaped through media and academia, the challenge of framing denialism in Canadian discourse, and then offering those perspectives on centering Indigenous truths in national education and reconciliation. With that, I'd like to pass that mic to you, Niigaan. Thank you.
Wonderful, miigwech, Kayla, and big thanks to you, Kayla, for continuing to do the work that you're doing. Most importantly, that this work isn't easy, and so a big miigwech to you for continuing to commit to this journey. I'm thinking about my father today, as my father would be very pleased that we are having this important discussion, and of course, Dad cared very deeply about reconciliation, and part of that is having frank, honest, also responsible dialogue when it comes to the issue of residential schools. And there is perhaps nobody that has demonstrated that's more for us than survivors during the period of the TRC and during the past few years, particularly when we have had varied political will when it comes to the TRC calls to action. It is the most committed to report in Canadian history, and of course, the most amount of actions have come out of the TRC. For one reason or another, other commissions, other reports have not inspired the same amount of commitments amongst Canadians. But we've seen a real shift, and in that shift in the past, let's say, few months, we are turning towards some habits that Canadians have done in the past that have demonstrated and created a rather toxic dialogue, a toxic relationship that all of us have worked very hard by simply talking, learning, listening, taking action, and then repeating all of those things since the end of the TRC. And I hope that today will produce that kind of commitment and an encouragement, as we say in Anishinaabe, "Angam is in." We got to keep going. We have to keep going despite the attempts by various different forces in creation to often interrupt, slow down, challenge our work. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present a series of facts We in the media, and I say that loosely for myself because I certainly am aware that I'm a columnist. I do some reporting, but I certainly don't pretend to be some of my incredible reporter colleagues at the Winnipeg Free Press. I certainly do, however, publish a lot on the issue of residential schools, mostly, frankly, by osmosis, by the fact that I've been around it my whole life. I'm an intergenerational residential school survivor. And then on top of that, I got to have a front row seat to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process as not just the son of Murray Sinclair Abun, but Niigaan Sinclair, but also as a person who was involved deeply in researching the TRC itself and the calls to action as a result. Big miigwech, thanks to the opening words today by Elder Crowshoe. Big miigwech, thanks to the NCTR and all the different people that are continuing this dialogue and this work. And a big thanks to my colleague, Sean Carlton. I continue to be very privileged, very honored to do this work with Sean. What I often say is that I learn a lot from the ways in which Sean has so deeply invested himself on this issue of confronting denialism, and the work that I do is better as a result. And one of the really great things that I really appreciate about working with Dr. Carlton is that this, for Indigenous peoples, confronting imagine that you're a scientist, right? Imagine you're a scientist who is doing work on a critical solution, a cure, an antidote for a major sickness. Let's imagine for a moment that you are every day working at that cure, that antidote. You're doing the experiments, you're engaging with other colleagues, you're consistently and continually committed to a goal of making the world a better place by eradicating sickness, by creating a healthier sense of self and body for others. Let's imagine that you are working every single day to confront a terrible sickness that is impacting the lives of so many different people. And then you're having to argue that gravity doesn't exist with something that is so obvious and that is so easy to disprove, but yet continues to infect this broader society by trying to convince others that gravity doesn't exist. And the reality is that often the conversation just simply ends in the first few minutes on just agreeing on the basic premises that if someone doesn't see that gravity doesn't exist, then I'm not sure what else we can talk about. If we're not going to talk about some basic facts and agree with some basic facts, which are presented by those who have experienced a system, an institution, a policy firsthand, instead we're going to believe a bunch of conjecture, subjective, politicalized positions that come from absolutely no firsthand information. If we're going to just make up facts and say things like we all live in a matrix-like box with a big thing hooked up to the back of our head, and that's somehow a fact, then I guess that just is where the dialogue ends. And this is particularly why I appreciate Dr. Carlton's work in really parsing out and challenging and engaging what are the motivations behind denialism, because I think absolutely is true. It is in many ways a sickness that's been produced out of ignorance. And I think it's an anxiety. I think it's a mental health issue in which individuals have been coerced, maybe taught misinformation, therefore spread misinformation, and it creates a kind of sense of a desire so deeply to want to believe in propaganda, in nonsense, in falsehoods, that it then creates a sense of a real paranoia or an appeal of conspiracy theories that then just encourages people to deny just that basic facts exist, like gravity doesn't exist. So with that being said, what I want to talk about is just some basic facts when it comes to the issue of residential school denialism. And these are the basic facts that I work under. And if there's, if these facts are at times debatable, then I almost don't consider the dialogue to be fruitful, because these facts are proven. There is well documented they're a well-documented proof. And whether we're talking about oral testimony or records or science, there is ample proof to prove a basic fact, and fact number one, which is that residential schools were the most devastating, the most racist, the most brutally violent policy in Canadian history. And residential schools, while perhaps at times by individuals well-meaning, or as indicated by Pope Francis, full of a kind of nationalistic discourse that convinced Canadians and Christians that this would be an avenue worth pursuing, whether it be the idea that Christians are guided by a notion of faith, that by forcing that upon others, which I don't actually think is based in the teachings of Jesus. It's based in the teachings of power and dominance, control, colonialism, empire, imperialism. That there's a fundamental, some sort of value or an altruistic value in that. If people want to convince others that non-Christians really are savages and that have no worth and that are basically livestock, like the Royal Proclamation indicates, or the papal bulls of the 15th century indicate, well, then there's nowhere else to go. It's if that's a position in which people want to argue that. I can tell you this, that I believe in the good of humanity, and I believe that all humans have a value. They all have something to contribute. And if there's a fundamental principle that argues with that, then I would always say to people, well, turn back to where your teachings come, or where you come from, or as Dr. Carlton just pointed out just a minute ago, what is the motivation behind seeing a group of people as inherently inferior, eternally not worth their own cultural values, their own positions, their own context, their own sovereignties. Now, if we take that into the issue of residential schools for just a minute, there is not one survivor at any point in history that ever thought a day playing hockey or learning how to play the piano or making a friend ever replaced your parents, the land, your language, even your hair. There has never been a survivor that has ever thought that having a good day meant that the system is redeemable. Now, there are individuals that perhaps thought that there were skills that maybe you learned along the way, but residential schools was built on the premise that Indigenous cultures, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, and everything there within were inferior. And so therefore, the very basic premise of the schools is wrong, period. So that means that everything that comes out of that is an important conversation to be able to investigate how did that occur. And that story, unfortunately, is not fully told for a bunch of reasons. One is that we had a federal government that for years lagged on documents. We had institutions as churches who either lost or didn't care for or were slow to hand over documents. In fact, I'm just speaking with individuals who are traveling to the Vatican, who have evidence of, who know where there are evidence of residential schools, who continue to assemble that story. And that means that we have to double down. We have to continue to search for what has been a national crime, as Dr. Molloy points out in his text. It has been to that we have a system that have been placed in Canada that we continue to understand or continue to investigate, continue to research in order to tell the fullest story of what has happened. And there is no getting over this. There is no, imagine trying to get over Remembrance Day or get over a war. There's no getting over it. It's just, how do we carry that? Do we carry it with the fullest sense of what the story is? With the fullest sense of those who are impacted by the story, and therefore the fullest sense of how do we move forward? Or do we continue to say, well, we're done with that and let's turn the page and let's forget about it? The problem with history is that, as Dr. Carlton will point out, that if you deny history, it will repeat itself. And for those of us that are most impacted by residential schools, we're just not going to let that happen. That this conversation of investigating further what has happened in residential schools is critical. And this is where the media comes in. This is why it's crucial that we continue to write, we continue to speak. And I'm not just talking as a person with a newspaper, There is continuing series of individuals, particularly survivors, but also now intergenerational survivors that are telling their stories. One of the biggest outcomes of Indigenous literature these days are biography. And it's kind of an odd state, I think, that you'll see oftentimes individuals who are in their 20s and 30s who are writing life narratives or memoirs. But that's how important this story is. To tell the story of how we've been all impacted by residential schools. And we are now seeing a cacophony of literature of Canadians also talking about that, encouraged by the TRC and the fact that the TRC was central to the core of the premise is that Canadians also have to tell their stories of how they were impacted, either by working at the schools, witnessing the schools, or being impacted in one way or another from the schools, living in the town beside, having a relationship with a survivor later, working with a person later in your life, or even during by experiencing those schools. And I've done a ton of different work in this regards. I can think of the story that I published in my own book, but also originally published in the Free Press, talking to flight stewards and stewardesses of the impacts of seeing residential school students being flown to those schools. Now, the key of understanding this is that the residential school process was not a natural process. It was an imposed process. And so that means the story is critical to tell. And we need to keep telling that story over and over again. And perhaps the most important story is what happened to the thousands, likely 10,000s of children who went to the schools and never came home. You know, in any other country in the world, any place, any time, if children go missing, we put an all points out bulletin. We actually call it a Amber Alert. And we all focus our attention on one child. For Indigenous communities, thousands of children went missing with no Amber Alerts. None whatsoever. And nobody, except for their families, their communities, their nations, their leadership, asked questions about it. Now, those children, some of them went missing from disease, and the records were lost, or records were maybe expunged or burnt. Some of them were from starvation, because we know starvation is directly tied with disease. And if you're starving, you are more ample to be sick. Some of them were just outright crimes. And one of those crimes could be overt. It could be murder. It could also be the conditions that were created in the schools, like, for instance, the architecture within the schools that created conditions for the sickness to permeate and to maintain and to spread quickly. There is so much research that is still necessary to understand the fullest version of what occurred at the schools. But the fact is this: children went missing. We don't know what happened to them. And that is a crime on all of us, every single person. And I want to treat the lost children at residential schools like an Amber Alert that we all should focus our attention on. And we should do that in perpetuity, because we shouldn't keep from the work that we're doing. Because if you know what an Amber Alert does in your own lives, is that you then keep your eye out. But you also keep with your work. You keep doing your job. You keep doing your raising your children. You keep working in society, but you don't keep your eye off the ball, which is that we're going to look for those children. Now, here's fact number 2. So fact number 1 is that thousands of children went missing. Residential schools were the most brutal policy in history, and that the story is still yet to be told. Fact number 2. Canadians have been chronically undereducated, and the media must play a key role in educating Canadians. And this isn't an objective or subjective argument. This is a fact that we need to continue to educate Canadians on basic facts surrounding the schools. And that means, how do we do that as reporters, as columnists? Well, we speak to the people who are most directly impacted. And then on top of that, we then go research, assist, engage, take those claims seriously. And then what we do is then we help cure ignorance, confusion, and then what I will call trauma. Because as Sean very amply pointed out just a minute ago, there are nationalist narratives that are within Canadian education, that is within every Canadian, in whether it be certain holidays that we celebrate, what languages we celebrate, how we tell history, that celebrate a particular kind of maple syrupy nationalistic monologue that then encourages denialism. And if I could just put a little asterisk on Sean's argument around Albert Memmi's work. And I absolutely agree that there is people who believe and people who accept and people who deny. That when a story comes in that interrupts that maple syrupy story. But I would say that amongst individuals who deny, and this is particularly well seen on comment boards, but also emails to me on every single time I write about anything about residential schools, but then also to my colleagues. And I think this is where my colleagues get very fearful because they get to have a little glimpse of what it's like to be an Indigenous person, which is to face the vociferous anger of trauma. Now, trauma produces two things. Anyone who studies Gabor Mate knows that trauma produces two things. One is silence, I don't want to talk about it, or violence. How dare you talk about it? Now, trauma encourages those two behaviors, and what is truly brave is to interrupt both of those, right? To challenge both of those. And with silence, you can work with that. You can work quite strongly with it. You can say, well, if we're going to be silent, then silence can also encourage you to listen. It can encourage you to learn. It can encourage you to take action on your own silence. Ask yourself what it is about that silence or shame that leads you to a sense of feelings of trepidation, anxiety about the Canadian narrative that you have been told, which has been absent of residential schools. And that encourages you to be in denial. And I can, very much, most Canadians I know absolutely feel quite nervous. They feel upset, and most retreat into silence, and some feel very paralyzed. The key is to encourage people to continue to grow and to realize that this is not often the fault of Canadians. There are certain individuals, as Sean pointed out, that is encouraging and spreading misinformation, but it is your inheritance. All of this is your inheritance. Just like you inherit land that has been taken from someone and given someone else, or just like we have all inherited people that were removed from territories, an economy built on their traditional territories, and that every single Canadian on every single paycheck, every penny on every paycheck is produced from Indigenous lands and resources. Just like Canada's built on the premises of Indigenous community building, which creates democracy, healthcare, multiculturalism, which English and French people did not invent but learned when they arrived here. And that then therefore helped build a country with Indigenous peoples. So that trauma is, I think, easily cured. It's by listening, it's by learning, it's by taking action. But listening to those who have been most impacted by residential schools, by listening to those who have experienced that and therefore researched it, not just firsthand, but also through critical work, well-researched, vetted, considered work. And if I could just add one more thing for just a minute, I don't think it's any coincidence that just as survivors are telling their stories, just as Indigenous researchers are entering institutions, just as Indigenous peoples are finally entering the publishing world en masse, talking about our stories, publishing our works, suddenly there is an equal or a large or certainly a very vocal group which says facts don't matter anymore. And everything is subjective and everything's a theory and everything's just about post-modernity or something or other. And we all got to listen to free speech, including arguing basic facts. I don't think there's any coincidence, and that certainly indicates how power works, because we should spend an equal amount of time listening to Indigenous peoples tell stories that are based in fact before we suddenly declare all facts are off. Because we have certainly, for 150 plus years, listened in an absolute monologue of particular groups of peoples in power positions in academic departments who rule publishing houses, who have dictated what the facts are. And they have had absolutely no interruption because the power systems in society have said that you have free reign to say whatever you want. And simply because you have a few letters behind your name, or that you're in a well-published publishing house, or that you have power or money, you suddenly get to determine what the facts are. We should be providing that for everybody, and particularly for those who have been cut out of those circles. Now, here's fact number 3. And this is what Sean well traveled. So I'm just going to sort of gloss over this a little bit, and we're happy to talk about this in the Q&A. Is that one of the challenges of trauma is not just silence, but also violence. And this is, I think, where denialists, or the most vocal of denialists, certainly people who are most apt to share their views, false as they may be, ungrounded in any sort of sense of facts or claims, maybe producing websites or that are, writing letters. But it would be simple to say if this was just a fringe minority, but oftentimes the chronic miseducation in society has produced some Canadians at the highest offices who have built careers off of deeply held views that Indigenous peoples are inferior, savages, deserve nothing more than to have their children taken away from their savage ways and put into schools where they will learn civilizing ways, which is just a fundamental wrong principle. See fact one. So when we have fact two, which is that Canadians have been miseducated, especially in the older ages, not so much in the younger ones. I was just at schools all this morning. We are raising the most competent generation in history. And so it's no coincidence that all of the major denialists are all of older ages, often older than me, and that they are often deeply embedded in these narratives because they come from being in school in 1970 something, or they come from a narrative that has encouraged people to reach certain power positions, or they have fostered a sense of power that has brought them to office, for example. So there's this violent denialism, which has been most oftentimes ends up in my inbox, or ends up in sometimes thrown at me in a Q&A here and there, or is in certainly a lot of my actually it's in a lot of written letters, because as I mentioned before, it's from an older particular larger aspect of an older crowd, is very irrational. It's very erratic, and it's often very angry and wants to lash out, as what Sean pointed out earlier, because it is a loss of power. It's actually a loss of sense of power. If you were to think really deeply about this, more people feeling empowered, feeling healthy, being engaged with society actually makes society better. So one of the biggest problems, I think, is that denialists are not just impacting people like myself or Indigenous peoples or residential school survivors, actually impacting all Canadians, because what they're doing is they're permeating and they're getting in the way of what is a healthy relationship. They're provoking conflict where there should be no conflict, or when Canadians are seeking to reduce conflict and try to embed themselves in processes in which they are working with, alongside, or even joining families, making families with Indigenous peoples. Denialists are saying, well, don't do that. That's not what our goal is to be. What our goal is to be is to just deny that Indigenous peoples are ever speaking any truth whatsoever, and they're only seeking handouts and money. And if you see recent statements by politicians in Ontario, you might notice that this is it's like an epidemic, a deep sickness in Canadian society of seeing Indigenous peoples as problems. And this irrational, erratic, angry position then deduces that Indigenous peoples are problems. And as Sean pointed out just a minute ago, that comes with real life consequences. It comes with serial killers who believe those who are spreading hatred about Indigenous peoples, and then therefore act hatefully. And that results in deaths, that results in chronic poverty, that results in people who discourage others to act with kindness, with generosity, to listen. It encourages people to shut off, and encourages less dialogue. And when you hear fact four is perhaps the most important fact of all. It interrupts fact four, which we have now arrived at. The most critical fact of Canadian society, which was envisioned in the treaties. And it was actually envisioned when settlers showed up in our communities, and they showed up oftentimes in October. Like, you'd have to be a total idiot to show up in Manitoba in October, because not only do you think you have hope of surviving before the winter arrives, but you would be dead by well, in the case of the Selkirk settlers, many of them were dead by Christmas because they didn't know, right? And when you come with an attitude that Indigenous peoples have no value, have nothing important to say, and that therefore you're not going to see where the medicines are, where the food is, where you should set up your home. You set your fort up on a floodplain. You don't build. You don't have time to build your home. You think, oh well, we'll just do it ourselves. Who cares about what they have to do over here? Never mind, they've lived here for thousands of years, and then you're dead by Christmas, most of you. And Chief Pegwis had to go over to Lord Selkirk, pick up all of those remaining men and carry them to Fort Pembina, and then say, well, come back next year when you have time to listen and you have time to learn. And because, Indigenous peoples don't have an altruistic, we're not perfect. We are not people who are built in some kind of sense of perfection, that we magically appeared in creation and had all the answers. In fact, we had very little answers when we showed up. That's where our medicines come from, our creation stories come from, our relationships with the animal beings, the earth beings, the air beings, the water beings. Like that's where it all comes from, is many mistakes along the way, many learnings or teachings along the way. And probably the most important teaching is that in this territory, or where we live in Kanata, is that the winter is coming. We're all in this together. The legacy of residential schools is not my history only. It is your history too. It is absolutely your history because you are living on lands that were impacted by residential schools. Your ancestors inherit all the things residential schools created, just like my ancestors did. And that you continue to live in an economy, in an environment, in a government, all of which is in the shadow, the residue of the impacts of residential schools, many of whom are quite brutal still today. Poverty, diabetes, child welfare, justice. Just go through the first 42 calls of the TRC. All of those are a recipe or of outcomes that come from residential schools. Child welfare, health, justice, education, language, culture, all of those things were impacted. And therefore, every single person that's sent a person to school, every single person that's interacted with a police officer or walked into court or got a parking ticket or paid a mortgage, or anyone with law, and then anyone who's ever experienced medicine, been in the hospital, talked to anyone about mental health, and can I keep going? Anyone who speaks to each other, anyone who lives in a society where democracy, healthcare, multiculturalism, and then also all the other things that go into, a Canada Strong policy today that is encouraging projects of national interest, which may threaten Indigenous rights if it moves too quickly. That is a society that is in the outcome, the shadow of residential school. And therefore, we must now be talking about this more than ever. And we don't have time to waste on does gravity exist or not. We don't have time to argue basic facts like, oh, don't listen to survivors, they're just looking to get money. Or, oh, those can't be grave sites at residential schools because we searched one time for a 5 by 5 meter or in a small little area, and therefore the whole thing's a hoax. Anyone who wants to see bodies is macabre. And oh, by the way, you don't even understand science, the way science works. I mean, we're talking about grave sites that are decades upon decades old, that were inappropriately buried most oftentimes, and that oftentimes are of small beings. We're probably not going to find bodies. If we do, we're going to find soil samples in which we will find residue of human remains. And that's going to take decades. Does anyone understand how science works? And so the fact that national newspapers are saying, show us the bodies, is probably the sickest, most macabre and grossest thing I've ever heard in my life. Like, would you ever say that up to anybody who's experienced violence? No, but for some reason, we've considered this reasoned dialogue. And that being said, I'm very proud to work for a newspaper in which we do not participate in that kind of dialogue. We do not participate in the kind of violent creation of division Now, do we publish pieces in which there are varied discussions around residential schools, discussions around where records are, for example, or what are the implications of, for instance, the IEP process records? Absolutely, because that's what a responsible newspaper does. But we also, and not perfectly, because we do make mistakes, consider the ways in which fact four, we're all in this together. And we don't have time to debate basic facts. We just have to realize that the only way we're going to get to positions in which we can build a healthy economy, build a healthy environment, stop blaming each other, or particularly marginalized groups, Indigenous groups, when we see problems in A and B or the first two, and that answer the existential question, what does it mean to be Canadian? We think of that as our central goal as a newspaper, which is we must tell the most fullest stories. And those fullest stories are by listening, considering, learning, taking action. That's what how we confront. That's the antidote to residential school denialism. And I'm happy to say that I do a project with young people, and this is what gives me, anyways. I hope it gives you a great deal of hope. I go to I happen to speak at around, well, if you're to just consider today as an example, 3 different classes of middle years students. And so I do anywhere between 10 to 15 schools, classes, groups of young people, sometimes seniors, churches, gigs a week. At this point, I've spoken to about 500,000 students, teachers, administrators across the country. And I do a little activity. I say, how many of you have an orange shirt? And I'm happy to say that for the most part, from Manitoba all the way to BC, the audiences are 100%. In Ontario, it's often 70, 80%. In the north, 100%. As you move east, it gets a little bit lower. I've been in audiences out in the Maritimes where orange shirts are not as easily found, and particularly in Quebec as well. But that being said, is that this has become a national conversation. It's a conversation that Canadians are engaged in, Canadians are invested in, and Canadians know that this is the only path forward. This is not an optional. This is not something in which we can say, oh, we're doing the right thing. What Canadians realize is that this is the only thing. This is the only thing we will do in order to be able to build a country together. And it will be difficult. As my dad pointed out, reconciliation is like climbing a mountain. It will be hard, but the path is just. And that we must realize that when we reach that summit, and this is my part, when we reach that summit, it's going to be something that we've never seen before. And we just have to keep believing in each other, helping each other up when we stumble, and don't get distracted. Don't get distracted by individuals who might think we can't do it or that we shouldn't do it. Because when we do it, we can do everything possible. And then we realize that there's more mountains to climb after that. And those mountains will allow us to see the fullest version of creation. And we will never be able to see it all, but we will always leave for our grandchildren a path that is proud, that is just, that is reasonable, ethical, and responsible. So with that, I say a big miigwech, and thank you very much for the time. And I'll hand it back to Kayla.
Hi. Thank you so much, Niigaan, for your presentation. Just as I did with Sean, I was pulling a lot of information from your talk. And again, it's answering a lot of the questions that I was going to pose in any case. But I have pulled together kind of a set of questions, a mixture of what's coming from the Q&A, as well as some of the kind of other questions that have been bubbling based upon listening to both of your presentations. And so I'll probably give one from the Q&A, then another, and kind of pass back and forth. But I know we have about half an hour left for this Q&A portion before we wrap up today. And so one of the first questions I wanted to tackle is related to words, the changing vernacular, and discourse. And so during the TRC's final report, they stated that residential schools were cultural genocide. However, this discourse has changed over the past 10 years, and I'm seeing more communities and the country really calling it genocide full stop. Could you share your perspectives on why we've seen this change, why it was originally cultural genocide to now fully accepting it as genocide?
Well, I know the exact reason why, like the factual reason why. And so, okay. So I actually wrote about this in my newsletter just recently because we're putting together a series of stories from Dad. And so, Dad, this is one of the stories that Dad, of course, I was front row seat. I was with Dad all the final years of the TRC, and I saw firsthand why this is. So the TRC commissioners absolutely were using the term genocide. This was not a debate. And you can speak to our colleague Andrew Wolford as an example. They regularly consulted with Dr. Wolford, who is a genocide scholar, over the issue and the inclusion of that term and whether it would fulfill Limkin's definition. And so absolutely. So, but here's the problem. You remember how the TRC had a false start? With Harry Laforme and the other two commissioners, that there was a number of money that were set aside in the settlement agreement, which created a 5-year TRC. That first year, unfortunately, was a false start. It used a lot of money. It also created a big bureaucracy in Ottawa, which the TRC had to move to Winnipeg, and there's a bunch of reasons why that was, political reasons for the most part. But it was expensive. And so when finally the TRC got restarted, they were 1 year behind and about a year and a half funding behind. And what happened was when the TRC had a year to go, and people can look this up if you wish, they were getting into financial challenges, not because of mismanagement, but because of the first year that was a misstart. That being said, the federal government had to be approached for an extension of the mandate because they were governing the agreement, the residential school settlement agreement. And part of that was the debate about how, about documents. The government is very slow in releasing documents. And many people felt, I've written about this, but many people felt that the government was waiting out the TRC because it was going to be an unpopular final report for the current Stephen Harper Conservatives. That's opinion. That's not fact. But here is a fact. Stephen Harper's government absolutely refused to accept that residential schools are genocide. And if you want evidence of that, check out the relationship between Stuart Murray, the CEO of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, and his removal over the issue of the term genocide that was used within the Museum of Human Rights over the definition of residential schools. So the TRC was in a very difficult position. They had to build a relationship with the federal government, ask for an extension of the mandate because of no fault of their own. And then on top of that, they were dealing with a government that simply refused to recognize genocide. And through that conversation, the term cultural genocide emerged. Because it is undeniable that culture was impacted, but the debate amongst the government, good, bad, great, ugly, is that the mental intent of genocide, for the fullest term of genocide, for the intent of the harm of children. That's Limkin's third definition, which is that the forcible removal of children from one group to another group was intended for harm. The argument of the government was that mentally was intended to be good. That physically it harmed, absolutely, removal of children from one group to another, but that there was a mental intent for good. Of course, the TRC didn't agree, but the TRC also did the best it could to navigate through that process. Now, luckily, as you can see with the National Inquiry of Murder, Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, they were not at that adherence and dealing with a government that was denying the basic facts around genocide. And so therefore they could use the term genocide. And then therefore the word has become much more regularly used within the discussions. But I can tell you absolutely, without any question whatsoever, that my father, in fact, he wrote a piece that was co-written with Stuart Murray from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, that he uses the term genocide, had always wanted to use the term genocide, and the term genocide is 100% applicable to residential schools, period. I hope that sets the record straight, because that's a story that needs to be told more regularly, and hopefully will be when we eventually get Dad's papers together and stories. So.
Yeah, thanks, Niigaan. Maybe just to add a little bit more onto this before we move on to the next question, Kayla, is that, okay, remember at the very beginning of my talk, one of the things I said about the TRC is that its formula was super clear. First, we must have truth. Truth will lead to healing and justice. Healing and justice will lead to reconciliation. Yeah. Denialists understand that formula really carefully. And what they're trying to do is undermine our confidence in the truth to close off the avenues to the healing and justice and reconciliation part. They're trying to get us stuck. Okay. And one of the key ways that they do that is by disputing terminology. And the term debates around the term genocide is one avenue that this often happens. And so my colleague Daniel Heath Justice and I have written a piece, perhaps moderators could share for the audience, kind of breaking down the most common talking points that denialists use. And what was number one? Debates around genocide, right? That cultural genocide isn't genocide. When in reality, as Niigaan was pointing out, the TRC didn't have a mandate to pursue genocide through legal channels. That's one of the things that's actually missing from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Is actually they wanted to bring different parties on board to share records, right? They wanted to create goodwill in terms of establishing that truth part, knowing that the justice part and the healing part would result from that. And as Niigaan's pointing out, there was hostility by the current government at the time. And so there was navigating that needed to be done in that situation. But here's the thing. If you look at the UN definition of genocide, okay, put it this way, when you ask most Canadians, they think of genocide as like mass death events equivalent to the Holocaust. But the person who came up with the UN definition of genocide understood it much more expansively. Yes, mass death events were one form of genocide, but as Niigaan pointed out, there were different kinds of genocide. There were different attempts to destroy, in whole or in part, a group. And residential schools, fit the other explanations of genocide, including the forcible removal of children from one group or another, the attempt to cause physical or mental harm. And so genocide scholars such as Andrew Wolford, and him and I have written a piece explaining this exact point, right? Very easily. The understanding of genocide has changed over time, like since the Second World War to today, right? It's a process of understanding what counts and what doesn't count for genocide. And so what denialists want to do to keep us stuck is they want to undermine people's confidence. So they will say, unless you can show me proof of mass murder, then this wasn't genocide, when that's not even how the United Nations defines genocide, right? And so it's a way of trying to move the goalposts to make it so difficult. Like, I need to see mass death or everything was fine. And you can see how that's a very disingenuous kind of strategy, right? To kind of stretch the definition to mean that it would be very difficult to prove that. And so that's how denialists are sort of engaging in these debates about terminology to try and shift the terrain, right? If you can't prove this, then everything was fine. And we should actually get back to thinking that it was well-intentioned and everything was great and we should just focus on all the positives. This wasn't genocide because you can't prove that it's equal to the Holocaust, which is a way that denialists are disingenuously engaging in that debate to try to shake people's confidence so that they're more amenable to hearing other denialist talking points and actually being like, oh, you know what, these right-wing, instead of going to Truth and Reconciliation, what else do you got? Yeah, let's hear more of these denialist talking points. And so we need to understand these different pieces as being connected, as gateways. If you can convince people that it's not genocide, then you have a better shot at convincing people that everything was well-intentioned, right? And it's just a big conspiracy, that there were no deaths, et cetera, right? So I think that that's one of the ways that we can understand how the terminology debate around genocide, right? Why it exists in the way that it does, and how denialists try and pounce on it to create space for doubt. When in reality, what we need to do is do the hard work of understanding what that definition is, how residential schools fit that definition, and why we're also not stuck to what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did valuable work, but it's really just the surface, right? They created a foundation for us. There is more work that needs to be done. There will be new understandings that will emerge from the foundation that they created for us. We're not wedded to what we understood in 2015. And so that understanding, as we get more access to records, for example, right? We understand that the number of children that died in schools were much higher, right? A lot of people will say, since 2021, there's been no more confirmed deaths. It's all made up. These are people that are not paying attention to the news. The Williams Lake School, right, without ground penetrating radar, has confirmed that there's the death rate in that school was 3 times higher than what was reported by the TRC because they didn't have access to full records from the oblates.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's just going to happen over and over and over again. We're going to understand, right, that the reported deaths of the TRC, right, was that we will know more as we get access to more records. And so I think that this is the thing, is that we need to also understand that this is ongoing information that we learn in an evolving way, right? And I think our understanding of genocide, people's comfortability with understanding that and being able to process it is also, I think, evolving as well.
I just want to add one thing to what you just said there, because you could replace genocide with mass grave, and that is also a tactic that's been used to delegitimize what have been very important research findings at residential school sites that suggest graves. But the term mass grave was used by a whole host of people, and I even used it a little bit when we, back when everybody was in shock because there was such a mass interest in what happened to the children, like what happened to the thousands of children that are lost in the records that the TRC had come out with, and subsequently now more children have been found to have gone missing. And the answer that potentially was coming from anomalies that suggest graves at residential school sites, like we already know that that's true. Like the Brandon Residential School here in Manitoba has an RV park just, paved right over top of a cemetery because the headstones, there's no, they were all removed. There was no markers, and so the city just simply sold that property. So the fact is 100% legitimate that there are unknown residential school grave sites across the country, grave sites across the country that are related somehow to residential schools. So, but when people use the term mass grave, they get these ideas of, the Holocaust or these Rwanda or these graves that are massive piles of just tragedy. That may not fit exactly the sites of what happened at residential school sites, but if you have 14 graves in an area, like what else do you call it? But more importantly is that we shouldn't get caught up in the like it was called a mass hysteria on a national newspaper that because the term mass grave may be obscured or wasn't 100% certain or didn't exactly describe what was instead of a pit there is potentially several graves, and that there's somehow that then delegitimizes the entire search for children. And it is exactly the kind of argument that does nobody any service. It is not responsible journalism, and it is 100% not a helpful contribution to a dialogue to simply say the whole story is a hoax because we didn't quite get the term that we were using in the immediate aftermath of discovering a traumatic potential answer to a traumatic situation. Exactly correct.
Yeah, that's that part of the denialism as a strategy to try and use particular pieces to then undermine something, right? It's like when one of the common denialist tactics is when people, denialists will try to challenge journalists or people that said, all indigenous children were forced to attend residential school, and they'll say, well, that's not true, and if you use that language, you're promoting this fake propaganda, blah, blah, blah. This is again, a semantic debate, right? Where, residential schooling actually was not mandatory, right? Until 1920. And there were some Indigenous parents who chose to send their children to school for a whole variety of complicated reasons. And what denialists are wanting to do is find this one thing to say, you're parroting this point, and they're trying to undermine everything else, right? They're trying to use nuance and
Just denying
complexity about.
basic testimony.
Yeah,
Just
and
denying the law itself.
yeah. So what they're doing is the appearance of trying to be particular, but what they're actually trying to do is undermine people's confidence in what they understand, trying to assume that the common individual would have the expertise of an expert, right? Who has the ability to have these very fine, granular conversations. So again, it's part of the strategy, right? To try and trip people up, to try and use errors that people make. And this is the other thing that Murray Sinclair will often talk. Whataboutism, distraction, right? Undermining all of that. But here's the other thing is that, when I started this work about 15 years ago, I didn't know, I grew up down the street from a residential school and didn't know, right? Like the kinds of learning that is happening about residential schools, settler colonialism, all of the different adjacent systems that's happening in this country is remarkable. There's a lot of learning going on. And what they're trying to do is if you don't get something right, they're trying to undermine and kind of like, discourage people from continuing to do that work if they make one mistake. It's about bullying and trying to close off people from the truth, right? Learning the truth is too hard. You're not getting any positive reinforcement for this. Like, give up. That's what they're trying to do. What we need to understand is that, sometimes we make mistakes. Niigaan makes mistakes. I can make mistakes. When Kamloops happened, I'm a historian. Like, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not sure about the particularities of what the difference between a pauper's grave, an unmarked grave, a mass grave are, right? What's being reported is there are large numbers of potential unmarked graves, right? People don't understand how things like ground penetrating radar work, right? It was confusing. People had to learn as more information became available. What denialists want to do is they want to look for one person who got it wrong and then use that error to kind of cast doubt on the whole thing, right? Show me this remain, or no deaths at residential schools, they didn't happen, or and therefore everything is positive, right? They're just trying to shift the narrative back to that humanitarian discourse. That's what they're doing. They're engaging deliberately and often for profit. This is the other thing we didn't get a chance to talk about, right? Is that a lot of the people that are promoting this are doing it over and over and over again for money on far right websites. They're monetizing misinformation, right? They're platforming it. They're trying to work with politicians to give it a bigger spotlight, to attack truth and reconciliation, not only because they benefit from it, in terms of their privilege, but also financially, it's advantageous. You can sell books, you can sell, tickets to lectures. You can get flown across the country to talk about all sorts of wacky stuff, and kind of, talk to people who are allured by denialism. And we just need to be more vigilant to understand that, we need to continue to focus on the truth, that the truth is an evolving process, that we will learn more over time, that this is the problems of residential schools were intergenerational, and the fix will be intergenerational, right? A lot more learning needs to happen before we can get on meaningfully to the reconciliation part. And we shouldn't be discouraged by that. We shouldn't let denialism derail our progress.
And the denialist industry, as it were, as you're coining perhaps here, is I think, of course, it's always going to be there. Like as long as there is humans who want to deny basic facts and try to yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire, just to get people to look, there will always be a few of those. What's encouraging to me is that it is increasingly not of a younger crowd, of a crowd that is competent, that is learning, that is engaged in responsible ethical materials that are vetted and that are considered. Now, I'm sure that can be a slippery slope, and certainly if we look to our relatives to the south, we can see how quickly things can go undone by a leader, by a group of people in charge who believe in conspiracy theories that are completely unfounded and reject basic science. So keep the work going. Ungama's in, like keep going. But I am increasingly hopeful and encouraged over the amount of young people that have. They are the most competent generation in history right in front of us, and I think that many of those denialists with their websites have a depleting audience.
The conversation has been excellent. I have so many comments where I'm like, oh, I wanted to share this, this, and this. And I'm looking at the time and I had a kind of a follow-up question, but I might, jump ahead as there's another one that's a little bit more relevant. But what I wanted to just pipe in with my 2 cents is kind of going back first to the comment about the Indian problem. I actually don't like that the quote that's often used, the residential schools were created to kill the Indian and the child. It's a misquote from the United States. I like the one from Duncan Campbell Scott to emphasize this context of the idea of colonization and how residential schools played a part in oh my goodness, I'm going to trip over this word, assimilation, and what that actually looks like. And his quote is, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue till there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. There is no Indian question. There is no Indian department. And I think that really speaks to that aim and purpose of the system. What I wanted to kind of also share is I find communities, that the general public are so fixated on the numbers and playing numbers games and comparing numbers. And I find, with all the challenges that we see in reporting, missing records, one of the things I always have to emphasize is what we're seeing right now is based upon a narrow scope or definition of what is a residential school, and then existing information. So I always emphasize what we're working with is the lowest based estimate on surviving information, not even taking a look at provincial territorial run residential schools, church only run residential schools, and all these other colonial systems that ran in the exact same format, which we don't have a commission for, or right now a mandate to look into those institutions. So that numbers that they play of, oh, we've only confirmed this many names so far, without even taking a look at the extensive amount of records we still have to examine, and then all these other systems that worked in the same way, those numbers could jump up exponentially. And so I always like to emphasize the information we have is based upon what still exists. And I did have a question related to the undermining piece, but knowing that we just had a few minutes left, the question I did want to pull from the audience connects to that youth and that hopefulness piece. The question was about, do we have any concerns that there will be backlash from future generations that learn these facts, but carry that guilt or anxiety that could provoke that denialism? I'll say from my perspective, working with youth today, I find they're the most educated, understanding, empathetic because of the introduction of these topics and seeing that and having that engagement, as you said, with Orange Shirt Day, and having that opportunity to learn at a very young age, which their parents, grandparents, family did not have that opportunity to do. And so I'm seeing more of that understanding, and then, often there's that conversation of let's look towards the future, but we can't do that without knowing the past. And so now we have generations getting to understand and knowing that past in order to then start thinking about, well, how did that connect to present day challenges, which I find is one of the huge bridging pieces, is how do we connect that past to current day? So I've mixed a whole bunch of things in there, but maybe I'll pause and just open it up again.
Oh, I feel tremendous hope. And I guess the question that you asked is there a potential for a backlash in the future at some point? So this is why the current dialogue on Bill C-5 is just so pressing and so critical, because what's happened is that the United States has threatened, and the president has threatened Canadian sovereignty, and it's created an anxiety amongst Canadians. And what's ended up happening is that then Canadians turn to, like, Canadians got a Canadian, right? And so the way that Canada has built the economy is by taking, stealing, exploiting Indigenous lands and resources, like hammering Indigenous peoples into poverty, keeping them there, putting policies and practices to make sure that they don't resist. And then, therefore, part of that is remove their children and teach them about everything about their ways is wrong, and the only way is to go forward is become a capitalist, an individual, and a competitive person who's selfish. And so, like that you can see the residue or the shadow of that starting to emerge with how Bill C5 is emerging, because what it's end up happening is that we're saying we're going to fast track projects, and that's necessarily going to involve Indigenous peoples trampled on, their rights trampled on, their put it this way, anyone who wants to say, hey, maybe we should think about this, will be deemed not in the national interest. Like, what else do you have to know other than that? And so here's my corrective to that is 100% that when people get anxiety, nervous, fear, feelings of uncertainty, they turn to old behaviors. We have to change those old behaviors. We have to give people hope, opportunity, and paths to effective, reasonable, responsible, ethical behaviors. And this is where the We Are Treaty People movement, I think, enters. But I also think it's helping people to understand that residential schools is absolutely not an Indigenous issue. It's a Canadian issue because it was produced by Canada. Canada created the residential school challenge for us in front of us. Indigenous peoples have always been the people who have turned to the newcomers and said, "Hey, let's share, let's learn from each other, and hey, the winter's coming. We gotta double down on each other." And so that's where all the things I spoke about before, healthcare, multiculturalism, democracy, the national economy, peacekeeping, all of those things come from Indigenous ideas. But particularly, we have to teach young people that Indigenous success means the success of everyone. It doesn't work the other way around. Canadian success often means leaving Indigenous peoples behind. And so what we need to do is realize that our success will be in how we double down on each other. That will stop any backlash in the future. When we realize that the truth of this country will always be in how all of us live, benefit. And I saw a little bit about that when Trump started to threaten us. We said, hey, let's turn to our neighbors. Let's deal with poverty. Let's make sure that everybody's included in this conversation about how to build an economy. But unfortunately, I think anxiety and fear makes people return and retreat to old behaviors. Our job is to try to give people positive cycles or positive relationships, role models. And I think we're doing that here today. We're doing that here by, 100%. I would stand beside Sean any day of the week. Not because I always agree with him, but because I believe that he thinks deeply, talks, listens, learns, takes action. And then, even when I make a mistake, he's not afraid to point that out. I'm not afraid to point out when he makes a mistake. And that we are working in a department in which there is an encouraged dialogue of responsible, ethical dialogue in which we can converse. And same thing with you, Kayla, at the university, that we all can work and converse together in a critical issue and be responsible, but not get caught up in, does gravity exist? Like we accept that there is facts that are presented to us, particularly by survivors, and that we're going to work with those.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Niigaan, and I mean, I guess to build on to that, one of the things that I often talk to people is that if you read the TRC report, it says very clearly in the beginning, right, that reconciliation is not an Indigenous problem; it's a Canadian responsibility. And I often sometimes hear students, my neighbors, community members think about reconciliation as like a cause. But the TRC was very clear that it was a relationship, right? That that non-Indigenous people are not Indigenous to this area, but we are in relationship. In Treaty One, we actually have a treaty, right? Where we work together as partners. And so I think of reconciliation as a relationship, and that denialism is something that poisons that relationship, right? It actually doesn't allow us to build better relationships, a kind of reciprocity, an ethical way of being in the world. We would never treat anyone else we are in relationship the way that Canada treats Indigenous people, right? You, as Niigaan was saying, in a relationship, in a partnership, right? Your partner's success is the collective success, right? You're working together, right? It means that you are in partnership. Um, and so I think for me, denialism is something. Denialists don't want that relationship. They want to keep Canada the way that it is because it benefits them, right? They're deliberately trying to halt the progress on reconciliation because they see it as a threat. But I think that's wrong. I think, as Niigaan points out, that reconciliation is an opportunity for Canadians to build better relationships, to build a more prosperous future for themselves and their children. And I think, the way that I end this with hope is that, as I said, I grew up in Vancouver down the road from a residential school and didn't know about it at all, right? I was educated in that ignorance. And that kind of educated ignorance means that people are more susceptible to denialist talking points because they don't know. But that's changing. This is what Murray Sinclair had said, right? That increasingly they will have a diminishing population of people who will believe them because more people will know the truth from survivors themselves, and because we continue to stick up for that. So one quick anecdote. My neighbor is a librarian for an elementary school and invites me to speak to young kids for I Love to Read Month. So I went and I was going to read from a book about called Fatty Legs, which is about a young Unix girl's experience in residential schools. And I get there and it's a grade 5-6 split. And before I start reading the story, I ask them, what do you know about residential schools? And if that had been me 20 years ago, I would know nothing. And this kid puts his hand up at the back, and immediately I'm thinking, ooh, should I have asked this question? Where is this going to go? And the guy, this kid puts up his hand and he said, well, residential schools were a church and state partnership that lasted for over 100 years, that often removed children from their families. And as a result, there were negative, effects. And now we have Orange Shirt Day, and we're trying to build towards reconciliation. And I thought, these denialists are done. The future belongs to people who understand this and want to work together to build a better future. We just have to have the conviction to keep going, to push people out of the silence, to challenge them on their violence, right? As Niigaan pointed out, and understand that denialism is just a tool to try and keep things the way they are right now, but they're losing. And we need to continue to move forward with that hope that a better future is possible by working together, by sticking up for the truth so that it can do its work of facilitating healing and justice and reconciliation. And on a daily basis, that's what motivates me to get out of bed, because I think that is winning the day, despite the rise that some, denialism is a backlash movement. It's not like it's going to happen in the future. It's happening now. That's why we have to intervene in it now and do the work that we're doing today. So I really appreciate this space.
Wonderful. I want to extend a big hi. Thank you so much, Sean, Niigaan, for participating in this discussion and dialogue. And I'd now like to invite Elder Harley Crowshoe to give us our closing. I think ending off on this hopeful component is a really great place for us to come back in the future again and explore this further, because I know there's a lot of questions and information people are still wanting to know more. But with that, Harley, please take it away.
Thank you, Kyla. Thank you, Niigaan. Thank you, Sean. The conversations, created that space so that we can be uncomfortable, because we learned from that. The conversation on denialism can be very hurtful for our elders and people that have experienced the residential school, and the pain that comes from it. So, and you're right, it is very distracting, and we need to continue to focus on that truth and be able to share that truth so that Canadians can understand what took place in the past and how can we, work together to create that future so it never happens again. So my prayer will be just to focus on that, but also before we start the prayer, I'd like to take a few moments of silence to reflect on those children that went to the residential school, the ones that went missing, whatever term that is being used, but the ones that never came home. When I was growing up, I remember the elders talking about that. And even though it happened in their past, it seemed to them they had the feelings of it happened yesterday. And they would have tears sharing that story of their missing friends that never came back and wondering where they went. So with that, we'll start off with taking a few moments to reflect on those children, and I'll start into prayer. And of course, we'll ask Vida, the Eagle Spirit, to carry our prayers in a strong, loving way to the Creator. Creator, thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity to be able to hear the presentations from Niigaan and Sean. And thank you, and thanks, Kyla, for steering us and moderating this conversation. This conversation can certainly be uncomfortable, but we need to hear it, Creator. We need to understand why this is happening. Creator, we just give thanks for the elders, the survivors that are still with us and still sharing their truths so that we understand what took place at the residential school, the impact of the residential school. So we give thanks for them, Creator, and ask you to watch over them, to bless them, to give them that strength and that health so they can keep moving forward on this journey. Because, Creator, the wisdom that they and the guidance they give us is so sacred. And we give thanks for that. Creator, we give thanks for the people that are helping us on this journey of finding those missing children, helping us in changing our lives so that we can deal with the impact the residential school had on all of us and be able to help lift our spirits up so that we can start beginning the healing process. We give thanks for that, Creator. Creator, we just give thanks for this opportunity today to be able to come together and hear what those challenges are and be able to, hear and feel those conversations that make us uncomfortable. But it gives us a better understanding, Creator. Creator, ask you to be with all of us and let us feel the love you have for your children. And when we struggle, ask you to help us lift our spirits up so we know that we're moving in the right direction. Give us that strength and that wisdom we need to continue. So, Creator, watch over all of us, and may we walk in beauty. All my relations. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much, Elder Croshoe, for that closing prayer. And before we close the room off, I just have a few last reminders for anyone who needs to access any support. The best support line to call right now would be the Hope for Wellness line at 1-855-242-3310, and the National Indian Residential Schools Crisis Line, 1-866-925-4419. And lastly, this will be the final webinar from the National Advisory Committee on Missing Children and Unmarked Burials as we wrap up our activities. But you can access all of the previous webinars from working with French records, forensic examination, and repatriation from a community perspective, the most recent ones on the YouTube page for the NCTR, as well as all the past National Advisory Committee webinars. With that, thank you to our speakers, our elder, our interpreters. A big thank you to our tech support and team, as well as to the audience who attended today. With that, thank you. Have a good day, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you so much.